Two claims. Both sound authoritative. Both are currently live in this channel's own catalog, in videos with hundreds of thousands of views between them. The first, that Lady Fermoy testified in court against her own granddaughter, Diana. She didn't. She testified against Diana's mother, a decade earlier, in a custody case that is arguably more damning than the version that has been circulating. The second, that the flag controversy at Buckingham Palace after Diana's death in August 1997 was explained correctly. It wasn't, and viewers who knew the actual protocol were right to say so. These are errors in videos published on this channel, and the record needs correcting. Viewers flagged both problems directly. A comment identifying the Fermoy mistake accumulated 6 likes, enough to signal that multiple people with specific knowledge recognized the error and agreed. The flag explanation drew a comment calling it explained poorly and incorrectly, which collected 19 likes. A third comment, pointing to a gap in the flag section's historical framing, gathered 60 likes. 60 people pressing a button to signal agreement isn't pedantry. It's an informed audience doing exactly what an informed audience should do. The comments were right. Both errors collapse important distinctions, placing a grandmother in the wrong courtroom against the wrong woman and misidentifying the constitutional logic at the center of the 1997 controversy. Correcting both requires going back further than the popular versions do, to a country house in Norfolk in the autumn of 1967, and to a constitutional rule about royal flags that predates every person in this story. Both corrected versions are better stories than the errors they replace. That is the actual argument here, and the evidence supports it at every step. Frances Ruth Burke Roche was born January 20, 1936, at Sandringham, Norfolk. Her father was Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy. Her mother, Ruth Roche, who would become Baroness Fermoy, was a Scottish-born musician. Lady Fermoy's position in the world rested on proximity to the Queen Mother. She served as a woman of the bedchamber and held both an OBE and a Dame Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. She was, in the language her world would have recognized, someone, and she had constructed that position carefully, year by year, through correct behavior, correct associations, and the sustained approval of the Queen Mother. That is the family Frances married out of and into, simultaneously, when she wed John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, at Westminster Abbey in 1954, with the Queen Mother among the guests. The Spencers were hereditary aristocracy, viscounts on the way to becoming earls, and the Fermoys were barons with royal connections that dated to Lord Fermoy's shooting friendship with King George VI. Frances was 18. The match made social sense on every dimension her world valued. The Spencer family's hereditary proximity to the crown, the Fermoy family's institutional proximity through Lady Fermoy's household role, and the relative social equality of the two families made the Westminster Abbey wedding exactly the kind of event that consolidated, rather than complicated, status. 5 children followed: Sarah, Jane, a son who died shortly after birth, Diana, born July 1, 1961, at Park House, Sandringham, and Charles. Diana was the 4th child, born into a marriage that had already been strained by the pressure of producing a male heir, by the death of an infant son, and by the accumulated difficulties of a relationship between two people who had married young into a framework that left very little room for either to become something different. By the mid-1960s, the marriage had calcified into something harder to leave than to maintain. Then Frances met Peter Shand Kidd, described in accounts of the period as an heir to a wallpaper fortune, at a London dinner party. She fell for him. In the summer of 1967, she left. Diana was 6 years old. Initially, Frances took Diana and Charles to London, while Sarah and Jane were largely at boarding school. Then, Christmas 1967 arrived. Johnny Spencer, the name his family used, refused to allow Diana and Charles to return to London with Frances after the holidays. The children stayed at Park House in Norfolk. Frances returned to London without them. That refusal was the operational hinge of everything that followed. From that point, custody was functionally settled, even before a court formalized it. Diana and Charles were at Park House with their father. Frances was in London, building a life with Shand Kid, and the social world around Park House had already decided what to call her. The Bolter. The period term for a woman who abandons her husband. The label wasn't accurate, or at least wasn't complete. She hadn't abandoned her children. She had left her marriage and was about to lose them in court. But in that world, leaving a husband at all was close enough to desertion that the distinction wasn't considered particularly meaningful. The legal machinery moved quickly. April 10, 1968. Janet Shand Kidd filed for divorce from Peter, citing his adultery with Frances Spencer. The affair was now on the record in a British courtroom. Frances's name was being discussed in proceedings that would appear in newspapers. For Lady Fermoy, a woman of the bedchamber to the Queen Mother, a person for whom social respectability was the architecture of daily life, this wasn't a peripheral embarrassment. Her daughter had committed adultery with a man aristocratic circles described as being in trade, had left an earl's heir, and had placed the family name in divorce proceedings. Multiple biographical accounts, including those drawing on interviews with people who knew Fermoy in this period, describe her as having deeply disapproved of Frances's departure and as being acutely sensitive to the social fallout. The Tatler's profile of Lady Fermoy describes her as known for fastidious adherence to social rules. The biography Diana by Tim Clayton and Phil Craig, which provides the most detailed chronology of this period in accessible secondary sources, situates her reaction within a world in which the sanctity of marriage wasn't merely a personal conviction, but a social obligation. September 1968. Frances went to court with a plea for custody of her children. She wanted Diana, Charles, Sarah, and Jane. Lady Fermoy testified against her. This fact is confirmed across every serious account of the Spencer family history. The Clayton and Craig biography states it plainly. In September 1968, Frances went to court with her plea for custody of her children. Lady Fermoy gave evidence against her daughter, and she lost. The Guardian's obituary of Frances Shand Kidd, published June 4, 2004, is equally direct. Lady Fermoy testified against her daughter in the acrimonious divorce from Viscount Althorp, later the 8th Earl Spencer. InStyle's summary of the biographical record is consistent. Lady Fermoy testified against her own daughter in court, helping Diana's father secure custody of all 4 children. The memoir, Lady in Waiting, drawing on close proximity to royal-adjacent circles, uses the same formulation. Fermoy testified against her daughter in favor of Johnny having custody. The biography, Diana in Search of Herself, describes Fermoy appearing as a character witness for the opposing side, a mother providing evidence against her own child in a custody case over that child's children. Wikipedia's article on Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy, states, Lady Fermoy testified against Frances, allowing Lord Spencer to retain custody of their children. The convergence across biographical, journalistic, and encyclopedic sources is complete. No reputable account contradicts it. Court transcripts from late 1960s British family proceedings aren't publicly accessible, so the specific wording of what Lady Fermoy said in that courtroom can't be verified verbatim. Biographers summarize her testimony as portraying Frances as having violated the sanctity of marriage, a charge Fermoy took with documented seriousness. Multiple biographical sources describe her as a firm believer in marriage as an institution. Multiple biographical sources also describe her, separately, as a terrible snob, in those exact words, across independent accounts. Frances had left an aristocratic husband for a man described by aristocratic circles as being in trade, which violated both principles simultaneously. One contemporary biographical account frames it directly. Her daughter suing for divorce was a huge scandal at the time, and Ruth Fermoy didn't want to risk her own social position by standing with Frances. That reading is interpretive. No primary statement from Fermoy in her own words confirms it. but it is the reading biographers have consistently attached to the documented choice. What is documented is the choice itself. She testified for the son-in-law, against her daughter, in a proceeding that determined where 4 children would spend their childhood. The outcome? All 4 Spencer children, Sarah, Jane, Diana, and Charles, were awarded to their father, John Spencer, Viscount Althorp. He is still Viscount Althorp at this point. He doesn't inherit the earldom until 1975. The children's primary residence was Park House, Norfolk. December 12, 1968. Frances sued her husband for divorce. He cross-petitioned, citing the proven adultery, and won. May 2, 1969. The decree absolute was granted. June 1969. Frances married Peter Shand Kidd. Frances maintained contact with the children after the custody ruling. The Clayton and Craig biography establishes she phoned them daily and shared weekends and holidays. She addressed the public narrative directly in an August 1982 UPI interview, stating she was hurt by suggestions she had deserted her children. She hadn't deserted them. She had gone to court in 1968 specifically to fight for custody of Diana and Charles, and lost. That UPI interview, conducted through journalist Gordon Honeycomb's work on The Year of the Princess, is the closest she came, on the record, to correcting the version of events that had hardened around her. The label, "the bolter," implying abandonment, had stuck, and Frances knew it, and she was still pushing back against it in 1982, 14 years after the custody ruling. The children who grew up at Park House after 1967 weren't children who never saw their mother. They saw her regularly. But they were children who understood, at ages 7 and younger, that their mother had gone and didn't come back to live with them. Diana reportedly sat on the front step of Park House waiting for her mother to return, for hours. Frances had promised to come back in a week. She couldn't, legally couldn't, after what had been decided in court. Multiple biographical accounts describe Diana as carrying a specific sensory memory of her mother's departure, the crunch of gravel as Frances's footsteps faded. Penny Junor and other serious biographers trace Diana's documented emotional patterns as an adult, the intensity of her need for love, the particular quality of her fear of abandonment, the speed with which she attached, and the force with which ruptures hit her, directly to these specific months in 1967 and 1968. Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, has spoken publicly about the damage the divorce and custody battle caused. The biography, Diana in Search of Herself, describes the wound as deep and psychologically crippling. These biographers are making a specific causal claim. Diana's adult emotional architecture was built in response to specific events. Lady Fermoy's testimony in September 1968 contributed to those events. She isn't a supporting character in Diana's adult tragedy. She is among the people who determined the conditions of Diana's childhood. One additional layer of Fermoy's biography bears directly on this story. Multiple accounts credit her, along with the Queen Mother, with encouraging the view that Diana Spencer would be a suitable match for the Prince of Wales. The LA Times described her in its 1993 obituary as considered the matchmaker, along with the Queen Mother. The biography, The Real Diana, credits the Fermoy family with placing Diana on the road to royalty. Fermoy herself denied the matchmaker role when asked, "You can say that if you like, but it simply wouldn't be true." The Andrew Morton biography that drew on Diana's own recorded testimony includes Fermoy's reported warning to Diana before the engagement was announced. "Darling, you must understand that their sense of humor and their lifestyle are different, and I don't think it will suit you." Whether or not she engineered the match, she was sufficiently close to the center of it that she knew it was a bad idea, and said so, privately, to the person most affected. Lady Fermoy died July 6, 1993. She and Diana weren't on speaking terms at the time. Frances Shand Kidd died June 3, 2004, from Parkinson's disease and brain cancer. At the time of Diana's death in August 1997, Frances and Diana were also not on speaking terms. The relationship between mother and daughter had moved through periods of closeness and severe estrangement, reportedly closer during Diana's marital difficulties in the early 1990s, then ruptured again over subsequent disagreements, and had ended, at least temporarily, in silence. The gap between this and the version that circulates is what the popular account loses by shifting Fermoy's testimony from Francis to Diana, from 1968 to the adult royal story. In the popular version, Fermoy is a courtier who couldn't break from the royal world even when her famous granddaughter needed her. That is a real part of her biography, but it makes her a supporting player in a drama the audience already knows. Keeping her testimony in September 1968, against her own daughter, in a courtroom that determined where Diana spent her childhood, that makes her a foundational figure. The difference between those two versions of Lady Fermoy is the difference between a footnote and an origin point. The second correction requires understanding a constitutional rule that is precise, counterintuitive, and almost never explained accurately in popular coverage. August 31, 1997. Diana dies in Paris at approximately 4 a.m. local time from injuries sustained in the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The Queen and the royal family are at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The flagpole at Buckingham Palace has nothing flying from it. The pole is bare, not lowered, not at full mast, empty. This is what the protocol requires when the monarch isn't in residence at Buckingham Palace. The only flag authorized to fly from that specific pole is the royal standard, the personal flag of the reigning sovereign, and it flies only when the sovereign is physically present at that building. The Queen is at Balmoral. The royal standard is at Balmoral. The Buckingham Palace pole is bare. A version of the controversy that circulated in coverage, including in the earlier video on this channel, presented the problem as the royal standard flying at full mast at Buckingham Palace as a deliberate sign of indifference, implying the crown was choosing not to lower a flag it was actively flying. That framing is wrong on a basic factual level. Buckingham Palace had no flag. The royal standard was 400 miles north in Scotland, flying at Balmoral because that is where the Queen was, and because the protocol requires it there. What the public saw in London was an empty pole, and they were right to find it inadequate as an expression of national grief, even if their understanding of why it was empty wasn't always precise. The constitutional rule that separates the royal standard from every other flag: it can't be lowered to half-mast. The UK government's DCMS guidance states this explicitly. The royal standard is never flown at half-mast even after the death of a monarch, as there is always a sovereign on the throne, and it would therefore be inappropriate for it to fly at half-mast. The Flag Institute states the same principle. The royal standard never flies at half-mast. It represents the monarchy, which is continuous. The logic rests on the constitutional maxim, "The king is dead, long live the king," meaning there is no vacancy in the crown, no interregnum, no moment without a reigning sovereign that would make the half-mast gesture coherent. The monarchy is the institution. The institution has no interregnum. The only documented exception was a mistake. After King Edward VII died in 1910, the royal standard flew at half-mast over Buckingham Palace for several hours until King George V caught the error and had it corrected. That exception is characterized by every source that mentions it as contrary to protocol, not as a precedent that subsequent generations could point to. So in the days immediately following August 31, 1997, the Buckingham Palace pole is bare because the Queen is at Balmoral, the same reason it would be bare on any day she wasn't in residence. Books covering that week described the pole as glaringly bare. CNN documented the bare flagpole explicitly as a focal point for public anger. The Daily Mail reportedly ran the headline, "Let the flag fly at half-mast." The public, gathering outside the palace gates in numbers that grew through the week, could see an empty pole above an empty building, and the emotional register of that image, in the context of a national death, was catastrophic for the monarchy's public standing. What the public was demanding, even without the technical vocabulary to name the constitutional distinction, was for a Union flag to fly over Buckingham Palace at half-mast. Before September 6, 1997, that had never happened. Not because it had been forbidden, but because the conditions for it had never existed. The Union flag had never flown from the Buckingham Palace flagpole at all. That pole was, before 1997, binary. Royal standard when the monarch was in residence, bare when she wasn't. No alternative, no gesture, no symbolic expression through this specific pole at this specific building during the sovereign's absence. Asking for a Union flag there at half-mast was asking for something the protocol had no precedent for, and the palace would have known that better than anyone. This is where the unprecedented framing the earlier video relied on becomes more layered than a simple one-word correction. Some accounts pointed to the period following President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 as precedent for British flag lowering, arguing the same general kind of thing had happened before and that the unprecedented label was therefore wrong. Researching this carefully produces a more specific picture. What is documented for November 1963, flags flew at half-mast at Westminster and across London for Kennedy's death. The U.S. National Archives Foundation records that the flags at Westminster were flown at half-mast, described in some contemporary accounts as a procedure normally reserved for the death of a royal family member. Images from the period show House of Commons flags at half-mast for Kennedy's funeral on November 25, 1963. These were extraordinary diplomatic gestures, documented and verifiable. What isn't documented? A flag being flown at half-mast from the Buckingham Palace flagpole specifically in November 1963. Every authoritative source on the history of flags at Buckingham Palace places the September 6, 1997 funeral as the moment a Union flag first flew from that pole at all, and first flew at half-mast. The protocol that kept the Buckingham Palace pole bare when the monarch was absent didn't appear to have a Kennedy exception. In November 1963, the Queen wouldn't have been resident at Buckingham Palace, most likely at Windsor, meaning the pole would have been bare by the existing custom. That is the same custom that left it bare in August 1997. Using the JFK moment at Westminster as a knockout against the claim that 1997 was unprecedented, trades one imprecision for a different one. Flags at Westminster and public buildings across Britain have flown at half-mast for various occasions well before 1997. The more defensible version of the correction is narrower and more accurate. The unprecedented claim holds specifically at Buckingham Palace. A Union flag from that pole for the first time, then immediately lowered to half-mast. What was new in 1997 was precisely located. Using that precision is more honest than dismissing unprecedented entirely, and it makes the story better rather than merely less wrong. Thursday, September 4, 1997. Buckingham Palace announced that the Queen had directed the Union flag be flown at half-mast over the palace on Saturday, the day of the funeral. The Washington Post reported this the following morning under the headline, "Queen orders flag at half-staff at palace," describing what was coming as a historic first, and explaining that for the Union Jack to fly at half-mast at Buckingham Palace was something that had never been done. That headline carried a precision most coverage of that week didn't. It named the specific flag and the specific building. Friday, September 5th. The Queen returned from Balmoral to London. The royal standard went up at Buckingham Palace because she was now in residence. That night, she broadcast a television tribute to Diana. Saturday, September 6th, the day of the funeral at Westminster Abbey. The Queen left the palace for the service. The royal standard came down. The Union flag went up over Buckingham Palace for the first time in that building's history, then was immediately lowered to half-mast. It remained there until midnight. Reports from that morning describe spontaneous applause from the crowd gathered outside. The Independent published a piece that day titled, "Protocol, a flag that flew in the face of the rules," describing Britain's national flag rising above the palace for the first time ever. Photo archive captions from September 6, 1997, record the event as the Union Jack flying at half-mast at Buckingham Palace for the first time in history. The Buckingham Palace spokeswoman confirmed the decision was a mark of respect for the princess on the day of her funeral. Prince Philip reportedly described the entire episode as a great humiliation, according to Town and Country. Whatever he believed, the protocol change held. Since 1997, the Union flag flies from Buckingham Palace whenever the monarch isn't in residence. It is flown at half-mast for subsequent royal deaths and national mourning events. The temporary concession became the permanent rule. Understanding this makes the Queen's decision more significant, not less. She authorized something genuinely new, under public pressure that had been building for 5 days, in the week after her former daughter-in-law's death. A woman she had stripped of the title Her Royal Highness the previous year, a woman with whom her relationship had been, at minimum, profoundly complicated. The protocol that kept the pole bare wasn't a passive oversight. It was an active, continuous constitutional tradition that had governed that flagpole for the entire history of the modern monarchy. Breaking it required a formal decision, a formal announcement, and the authority of the sovereign. The crowd that applauded on the morning of September 6th when the Union flag rose, estimated at 2.5 billion viewers worldwide watching the funeral coverage, was watching something that had genuinely not happened before at that building, even if flags had flown at half-mast at Westminster and across Britain on earlier occasions of national mourning. The error that needs correcting in the flag section isn't unprecedented as a word. It's the reasoning attached to it, and the conflation of the royal standard with the Union flag that made the public controversy seem to be about one thing when it was actually about another. The controversy wasn't about the royal standard being kept at full mast as a snub. The royal standard wasn't there at all. The controversy was about the bare pole, the absence of any visible acknowledgement, and the question of whether an institution that had never flown a Union flag at its London headquarters should do so now. For a woman who had been, until 14 months earlier, its most prominent member. Both of these corrections share the same underlying mechanism. Lady Fermoy testified against her own granddaughter Diana, requires nothing from a listener. Every viewer knows who Diana is. The emotional connection is immediate. Lady Fermoy testified against her own daughter, Frances, in a custody case over the Spencer children in September 1968, requires the listener to know who Frances was, what the proceedings involved, and why the outcome mattered. It carries more information but demands more context. In any chain of retellings, one video citing another, one article condensing the last, one comment summarizing what the article said, the version that can be grasped in 5 seconds consistently outlives the version that requires 20. The simplification isn't deliberate distortion, it's structural. The granddaughter connection to Diana requires no explanation. The daughter connection to Frances requires knowing who Frances is, what she did, why the custody hearing happened, and why its outcome matters to the story of who Diana became. Every step in that chain is a point where the retelling shortens. The flag version runs on the same logic. The palace refused to lower the flag to half-mast and the public was furious. Maps onto an emotionally legible structure. Establishment resists, public pressure mounts, establishment concedes. The accurate version, bare pole, constitutionally absent queen, prohibition on lowering the royal standard for reasons that predate living memory, first ever Union flag at Buckingham Palace. Deliberate protocol break on the morning of a funeral watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people, is more specific at every point. Specific enough to verify. Specific enough to correct. Specific enough, on reflection, to be a better story than the compressed version, because it clarifies what the Queen actually did. Not lower a flag, but authorize one that had never existed at that pole, in response to a public pressure campaign that had already reshaped how the royal family presented itself for the rest of that week. The mechanism that drives both errors is the same one that drives most persistent historical inaccuracies. Not malice, not incompetence, but the natural pressure that forces a sentence to become shorter every time it gets retold. What survives is the version that needs the least context to be understood. And context is exactly what makes the accurate versions of both stories more meaningful. The Fermoy correction moves her from a cameo in Diana's adult tragedy to a central figure in Diana's childhood. The flag correction identifies what the Queen actually authorized and why a constitutional tradition that had existed for the entire history of the modern palace was broken, specifically, on the morning of September 6, 1997, and never restored. Getting either of these wrong doesn't make the larger story false. Diana's childhood was still shaped by a painful custody battle. The palace did still face extraordinary public pressure in the week after her death. The Queen did still eventually respond in a way that satisfied the crowd. These facts survive both errors, but they survive diminished because the error removes the precision that makes the story verifiable, and verifiability is what separates history from mythology. The simpler version of a story is usually the one that survives. Fermoy testifying against her own granddaughter is a cleaner sentence than Fermoy testifying against her own daughter a decade earlier, even though the second one says more about who she actually was. Getting the flag right doesn't change what it meant to the 3 million people who lined the streets of London that Saturday morning. But getting the story right always matters more than getting it first.